Welcome to this MacArthur Memorial virtual presentation. Thank you for joining us. At the memorial, we believe there is no substitute for history, and that drives our work to preserve and share the story of General Douglas MacArthur, the millions of men and women who served with him, and the world that they lived in, through free exhibits, education programs, research, events, and virtual programs like this one. By joining us today, you help support that mission. If you'd like to deepen your involvement, though, we invite you to join the General Douglas MacArthur Foundation's MacArthur Committee. There will be a QR code on screen, and you can also find a link to that included in the program description and in the comment section. Currently, it's July 2026, and the men's Tour de France, one of the world's great endurance competitions, is underway. General MacArthur believed strongly in the value of sport, and he was an absolutely enthusiastic advocate for all types of athletic events, especially international competitions. The intersection of sport, conflict, and history is an area that we explore here at the MacArthur Memorial. And today's topic, the 1919 Tour de France, is a reflection of that. Just months after World War I ended, riders crossed a devastated France, racing over ruined roads, shattered infrastructure, and landscapes that were marked by war. Whether rider or spectator, all had been touched by war. And so this grueling race became a powerful symbol of rebirth and resilience for both France and for international sport. Our speaker is Aidan Dobkin, author of Sprinting Through No Man's Land, Endurance, Tragedy, and the Rebirth in 1919 Tour de France. If you follow the MacArthur Memorial's World War I podcast, you may remember his 2022 episode on this subject. As is often the case with scholarship, his research didn't stop with the book, and we are delighted to welcome him back to share new insights into the 1919 tour and to explore its connection to French nationalism and nationhood in the post-war period. If you're watching live, please feel free to leave comments or questions in the comment section. We will have time for a brief Q&A after the presentation. So ladies and gentlemen, Aidan Dobkin.
Hi all, it's lovely to be here with you tonight to talk about the race as it goes on in Europe. I'm gonna presume that everyone has at least like a basic understanding of the race, but I'm gonna talk a little bit about its features and what you might encounter these days, as well as how that relates or differs from the original conception of the race. So for anyone who's tuned in the past couple weeks, you maybe have seen a multi-stage bike race in the Tour de France. What that means is cyclists set out at one point, they end in another. These stages take place over the course of a few weeks. Getting in a little more granular detail, you have teams that are riding, competing for the general classification, the yellow jersey. There are mountain climbs that have their own leaders. There are sprints. Within the kind of peloton, there are specialists, people who really excel in mountain climbs or who really excel in short distance sprinting. There is going to be cyclists who are really there for support, who maybe are really unlikely to win the race, but who allow the real competitors to conserve their energy for the moment in which it would make the most difference. You see over the course of a few hours, cyclists riding through towns where people line the streets. And some of these bear some similarity to the early race, but there are many more differences. So the Tour de France, by way of a brief context, started in 1903. It was founded by the sports daily L'Auto, which was itself founded by anti-Dreyfusard advertisers who did not like the political tack taken at the competing Le Vélo. These advertisers hired a publicist who had worked for them in advertising, Henri de Grange, to run Lotto. So from the start, you have these kind of corporate interests who, unsurprisingly, are thinking about how do we get this new sports daily off the ground and competing with these longer standing establishments. Henri de Grange and the journalists working under him at Lotto thought to have a long multi-stage race that circumnavigated the country. This was a time of kind of extremes in cycling. You had I'm here based in New York at an arena like Madison Square Garden, you had things like 6-day races where teams of cyclists raced for 6 days straight to just see who could get the most laps in that time. So there is this, notion of cycling as an endurance event much more than the kind of sprints and really peak competition that we have today. There were stage races, something like the Paris-Roubaix, where over the course of a couple hundred miles, over the course of a day, cyclists would ride. So an extended day-long event. But Henri de Grange and the cyclists or the journalists rather at Lotto wanted to make that a lot bigger. And so the idea was struck to have a multi-stage race that would circumnavigate the country. And as you see in the presentation, on the left side of the screen is the 1914 map of the Tour de France, which shifted every year, as you might be familiar with. But really starting and ending in Paris and taking cyclists who competed in the race really to the edge of every boundary of the country. In contrast to what you see in the 2026 race on the right side of the screen, where cyclists kind of cut through the middle of France with some sections in which they actually don't even ride, but are instead transported from one location to another. Everything that you see on the left side of the screen, these cyclists rode. And that means, couple hundred miles every other day on average. So this top-down perspective created by Henri de Grange and the journalists at Lotto has within it the kind of key ingredients to have a race that is bound up in notions of nationhood, in the race really kind of transiting the entirety of the country, in binding those different parts of the country together in this race, corporate interest, conservatism based on the fact of Lotto's response to the Dreyfus affair in competition with Le Vélo. And so there are these big top-down ideas and concepts driving the race from the perspective of de Grange and the newspaper. And yet, de Grange was really an effective publicist. He knew he had never done anything like this before, at least not to this degree, but he struck something, and his journalists who really kind of came up with a lot of the elements of the race really struck something solid in the concept of the Tour. And so alongside this top-down conception of the race that does have these ideas and notions of nationhood and nationalism, there is also the bottom-up conception of the Tour as it exists for someone who watches it pass by one day and who otherwise reads it in the pages of Lotto. So there are a couple years at first where things are a little bit rocky. The cyclists who might compete in the race, just like the people who had never seen something like this before, didn't really know what they were getting themselves into. They, didn't generally ride that distance. There was, I believe 20,000 franc purse for the winner, but it wasn't clear if there was a payoff for them. And so The first couple years of the race, there was a relatively small group of cyclists who rode in it. There was rampant cheating because they rode throughout the night and there were not umpires or even journalists to kind of closely follow them. But the race survives, it grows, and so alongside this top-down conception of the race, there is also this bottom-up experience of it for the average Frenchman, for the cyclist. And this bottom-up conception is really how I came to the 1919 race. I was working on a novel about a soldier who had fought in the war and walked south to a part of the country, relatively geographically and untouched by it. And as I was conducting research for this novel, I was looking at some events that might kind of ground it for me, and noticed that the tour passed by just months after the war's end, and I hadn't really thought about it too much to that point, but I had reported and ran a podcast on World War I and all of these things, and my interest and my excitement about something like a race so soon after the end of the war was immediately struck, and it only grew after I kind of saw where the cyclists rode through and who started and who finished. So I mention all this as context. What does the race really look like or feel like if you are a Frenchman living in the northwestern part of the country, let's say in the 1910s? If you're near the start of a tourist stage, you are maybe getting up at 3, 4, 5 a.m. if you want to push it, just to see the cyclists set out. That is how early they are getting up. If you are near the end of a stage, you might have to wait up past midnight to see the last cyclist ride in. They are quite literally, with breaks, of course, and for eating and whatnot, riding all day on the days in which they're riding. If you feel like it, you can ride alongside the cyclists for a stretch. You probably wouldn't ride for the entire distance, but there is, even today, if you're a regular kind of tour watcher, you probably are well familiar with the arguments about how close fans get and the ways in which they affect crashes and whatnot. And fortunately, given the relatively slower speeds back then, this dynamic still existed, but created significantly fewer problems. These tour cyclists rode for corporate outfits, but the key point is that they really rode independently. The corporate outfits provided them with a salary. In the first years of the race, they had to provide their own food. They had to provide their own bike frame, their own tires. Not only do they have to provide them, but they had to maintain them over the course of a month and thousands of miles. Amateurs rode alongside professionals to the best of their ability. The main difference being that the professionals were, most often paid a small salary, whereas the amateurs got any prize money, but that they, earned, but otherwise did it for the love of the sport. The overall tenor of the race, as you kind of watch it, is people just trying to get to the end of the day, and then do what they can to regroup over the course of one day generally, before doing the same thing over again and over again and over again for an entire month. That means that many of them were on a cocktail of drugs and alcohol that had none of the science that performance enhancing drugs have today, and were instead mostly used to dull pain and just kind of allow people to bear through it. And so you as a Frenchman are really only seeing, a small snippet of the race as it passes through your town. But it is this very close, unmediated moment for Frenchmen, for witnesses, for spectators. And then you pick up Lotto, the exclusive coverage provider of the race in these early years, and you can read about the fortunes of people as they succeed or fail over the course of an entire month. You and a few friends might get together and provide a small purse to someone who is a local writer, perhaps, or who you really liked and bought wine for in your town. And so it is a very endurance event. It is an event that really, really, really emphasizes independence and kind of general physical fitness more than outright athleticism. And I think, based on your own understanding of the race and World War I, you can probably see how some of these pre-existing qualities become heightened in the wartime years. So the 1914 race starts on June 28th, the day of Franz Ferdinand's assassination. It carries on until July 26th, about a week before the invasion of Belgium. And then from 1915 to 1918, the tour does not exist. It does not run. Cyclists are called up as reservists. Sponsoring companies retool their factories. There are quotas on paper and rubber and various other supplies. Lotto continues. It kind of renounces, without a grand statement, their kind of ostensibly apolitical stance that brought them into existence, and takes on a more openly nationalistic, conservative tone, often expressed by Desgrange himself in editorials. Desgrange, outside the age that Frenchmen were called up to become reservists, but nonetheless leads a physical fitness training program in Paris, which very closely matches up with his views on athleticism in general. This is not unlike the Olympics at the time and whatnot, where these ideas of masculinity and physical fitness and nationhood are very closely intertwined. And then also joins a line infantry unit to kind of model what he thinks of as important qualities for Frenchmen. So late days of 1910, Lotto exists. It continues in this reduced form during the war, but this backbone of its identity has been lost for years, and most every element that made the race possible has been debilitated or destroyed. Previously winning cyclists were killed in the war. Those who weren't killed or injured have not trained in years. It is the outlier who was really able to cycle at all. Sponsors once again had to retool their factories now that the war was over. The roads in most places are decimated, or at least haven't been maintained. And yet, there is a need on Desgrange's part, on Lotto's part, you could say on the French people's part, to reignite this event that existed and kind of brought together the country. And so on November 20th, a week after the signing of armistice, Henri Desgrange announces the existence of the 1919 race. And here we see the continued importance of this top-down conception. As much as the bottom-up experience is also important, is there is this leader in Desgrange who is pushing the race onward in its kind of maximalist form, even when it seems most unreasonable to do so. He wants the tour to go further east than it had ever been to account for the territory claimed in the war. And that will make the 1919 race the longest that it had ever been. Over the course of the following months, so this is the middle end of November, Desgrange calls for the start in June. That only gives him months. Pieces start to fall into place, even when it seems unlikely that they will do so. La Sportive, which is a conglomeration of companies, agrees to sponsor the top riders, as opposed to competing against one another. a small selection of competitors start to form. It's not as large as in past years, and it's a bit older too. The cyclists who maybe would have cut their teeth and become really good in the kind of general arc of a cyclist career back then in like their late 20s were those who were called up in the war, who were on the line infantry units, who would have had a difficult time getting any sort of accommodation. We see fewer of these cyclists and more cyclists who had become accustomed to what the tour required of them, who were maybe in reserve units, or maybe even in engineering or cycling units where they were able to kind of continue this practice even in a reduced form. So this group starts to form. This is, a small selection just posted in a magazine of the time. 67 cyclists will ultimately start the 1919 race. So just to kind of, pick one who I like, Eugene Christophe, 34 at the time of the 1919 races start, a little bit older again than the most competitive cyclists in other years, had finished his mandatory service in 1906 with the 119th Infantry Regiment, where he acted as a bike messenger. He was called up again in August 1914, served in an infantry unit, but then went into cycling and then an aviation unit, where he continued to get mechanical expertise, which is what he did as a day job. And he was even able to compete in a few smaller races in the course of the war. So we see in Eugene this some of the qualities that the tour always emphasized, but really truly emphasized in the 1919 race. A mechanic who was able to kind of sustain his bike frame through anything that it might come across. He was a cyclocross racer. For those of you who are not familiar, cyclocross is almost an obstacle course form of cycling where you have to carry a bike frame up muddy sections and ride it at other sections. Really a kind of everyday person, an incredible athlete, but not necessarily what we think of as a modern athlete, a much more everyday person. So on June 29th, rather, the 1919 race starts, and it will exist in these stages that I'll talk about in a teeny bit of detail, and hopefully you can at least kind of see some of the distances. The 1919 race did not have a fancy map like 1914 did, I think, on account of paper quotas, but we do at least, of course, have the stages. And so all of these qualities that existed in the earlier versions of the Tour de France, as I mentioned, were just magnified in its 1919 edition. Cyclists who competed in the 1919 race were going to ride, if they could, for 5,560 kilometers or 3,450 miles. I think if I have my math correct, that's like kind of across the country, the United States, that is, over the course of a little less than a month. Because of the condition of roads, because of the lack of training, cyclists' average speeds were down by 4 or 5 kilometers. Only 10 of 67 cyclists finished the race. So every day that you would read an edition of Lotto, they would tell you of, 4, 5, 6, 7 punctures through even, relatively fine stretches on the northwestern part of the country. Cyclists were constantly stopping to repair their tires and bike frames, those that, again, could, because it was entirely on the cyclist to contend with whatever they came across. Injuries were frequent. I believe, even one of the cyclists got trench foot, and kind of some strange irony of this race. And so this was a sporting event, but it was a very odd one to our eyes, and maybe even boring in a lot of places. It is not intended to be witnessed on the television. It is not intended even to be listened to on the radio. It is intended to pass by the most people that it could and then be recounted in the pages of Lotto. And by kind of crossing the country, you could kind of, the way I think about it is like it's almost like a net that traps as many potential Lotto readers within it as possible. And there's an element of chance too. A bad break could put someone out of commission, and nothing you could do as a cyclist could prepare you for a bent frame if you're not a mechanic. There are only two gears back then. You have to flip the tire around to go into the lower or higher gear if you need to, ascend a mountain, for instance. And the race does not get easier over its course. So it starts in Paris, it cuts northwest, everyone rides down the western coast and then enters the Pyrenees. So right around the middle is where the mountain section starts. They cut over through the Mediterranean, up along the Swiss Alps for a second mountain section, and then they actually reach what was the Western Front. Again, Desgrange wanted this race to go further east than it ever had, and that meant quite literally entering battlefields. Only months earlier, these distances were just as long. The Metz to Dunkirk, some of the worst that the cyclists would encounter was 290 miles that they had to traverse in a day. They rode through a place like Valenciennes, that was the site of a battle in 1918, whose roads, whose cobbles were broken up, whose streets had been cleared for them mostly, but between towns, you will find debris, you will find, potentially shrapnel, what have you, that these cyclists had to contend with on their own. And this is really what is so fascinating to me about the 1919 race, that all of these qualities that existed in this very unique event that I think in many ways couldn't have been created in the post-war era, but had just enough scaffolding to exist through this domineering personality of Henri Desgrange, was able to kind of restart shortly after the war. And all of those qualities that had various connotations and emotions and ideas bound up within them, as well as various emotions and ideas, some of the same, some of the different, for the average Frenchman, came together in this extreme version of the race. And it's such an interesting window, I think, into post-war psychology to think about cyclists who, just months before were fighting in some of these locations, to think about nationalism and patriotism in this domineering personality of Desgrange, who, yes, liked sports, but liked the idea of sports and liked what sports did for his country. This is not yet an international race. There were no Germans in the 1919 race. There were mostly Frenchmen, some Belgians, some Italians. It is such an interesting window into that kind of nexus of culture and war. This hopefully gives you a little bit of a taste for it. I don't want to spoil, some of the kind of goings on of the race itself in case anyone, feels like recreating the excitement for themselves. In my book or in the other writing that has occurred, if you speak French, the editions of Lotto are available digitally on the French National Library, and they're wonderful to kind of, as a resource, literally corner by corner, you can trace the cyclist path so that if you were a spectator, you could watch them cross by, which is what I did in the course of researching it. And so I think it's a wonderful window and a really unique window into this event and into this post-war psychology. And so I'm happy to kind of talk to you about it further. I'm happy to answer any questions about research or the writing of this book or anything that I learned. So yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Well, thank you, Aiden. Thank you very much. That was pretty interesting. We're going to queue up the questions right now, but let me start off with one. This is the first race where you see the yellow jersey, correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. Any of the other jerseys or just the yellow jersey?
I believe just the yellow jersey. The more, there were, in the 1919 race, in addition to this independence, there is also a very genuine sense that there is only kind of one race. You can be an amateur and you're not paid a salary and you are technically in a different classification. And so you could be the leader of the amateurs, but apart from that, and small purses that kind of existed for often crowdfunded essentially from towns, or sometimes veterans of a particular unit would give prizes. Sometimes they just chose whoever they wanted. Other times it's like whoever rode into town first. But the race itself, the kind of modern day iteration of the race with these various classifications and types of cyclists. Obviously, there were types of cyclists back then, but you were ultimately only rewarded as being the leader in the general classification or not.
Okay. All right. Next question. Can you explain issues that happened to the Tour de France during World War II when it was canceled, and then the post-World War II Tour de France? And then were there any traditions and customs from that period of 1919 to 1939 that were lost in the future?
Sure. I'll try to answer this in a couple ways. My expertise is less on the tour right around World War II, but I am familiar a teeny bit with Henri de Grange, who really was a kind of strong holdout, perhaps unsurprisingly, in the lead up to the invasion of France. What you generally see is the tour responding to the mediums that people experience it in. So it was in the early 1930s, I believe I have that correct, where coverage of the race was opened to other media outlets. Prior to that point, Lotto had exclusive coverage, which mostly meant that they weren't gonna help anyone out who wanted to write about the race. They weren't gonna carry any other journalists in their cars. So there was magazine coverage. Some of the photos that I included in there are from the magazines, La Vie en Grandeur. But Lotto was kind of the exclusive provider. With the advent of radio and then television, this exclusive element of the race, is no longer, it's no longer possible to keep that monopoly on the race. And as that monopoly is lost, as the tour becomes an event of its own, not just a means to sell editions of Lotto, you start to see the shorter days that are more realistic for people who are listening to radio, who are eventually witnessing it via television. So that's some of it. I mean, I think, in terms of traditions and customs, I think what you in large part see is just less independence on the part of the cyclists. This is, it is much closer. The closest thing I think we have in modern times is something like an ultramarathon, but an ultramarathon doesn't even really cover this, in the sense of These are people who are existing on their own, not in the wilderness, but existing on their own for a month, which means in the first years of the race, buying their own food, maintaining their own bikes, what have you. And that is the part of the tour that kind of gradually declines for this more, to our modern eyes, kind of athletic competition where there is really much more of a race than an endurance event. So hopefully that covers some of it. I do think the kind of concept of the tour cyclist, the amateur who can ride alongside the professional, all of whom are riding independently, is kind of the thing that really declines over the course of the race.
Yeah. Going back to World War II for a minute, I think I read one time that the Nazis really wanted the 1940 tour to go forward, and even in the years after that during the German occupation, but that the tour organizers continued to kind of reject any of those proposals. Have you done any research in terms of that area?
A little bit. I mostly relating to Henri de Grange and his kind of strong desire to have France fight to a much greater degree than wound up happening, and did kind of that ideology thinking extended to the tour as well. As is probably not hugely surprising, his notions of physical fitness, nationhood, whatnot, could very easily be co-opted by whoever was governing the country and neatly matched up with, Nazi ideology at the time. So there is this interesting tension that exists in the race and in Henri de Grange in navigating this kind of notion of patriotism and how it can be co-opted in the particular form of the race, and how it didn't exist. But I don't know a lot of the machinations. What I do know is that the archives of Lotto, I believe, were on a train bound from Marseille during World War II, and were destroyed in the course. So it is a limit on what a historian kind of wants to understand about the inner machinations of some of these discussions, because the editions of Lotto exist, but the internal documentation has been lost.
Right. Okay. All right. And we were talking before this started about the actual the route of the tour and how it's changed so much over the years. But I guess, during World War II, I guess it would have been an interesting situation. Does it go through occupied France and Vichy, or how do we do this? I'm sure that was part of the conversation as well.
Yeah. And I mean, something going back to the question on traditions and whatnot, another thing is that the over time, it does become more of an international event. It is, in its early stages, not an exclusively French event, but that is kind of the idea behind it, and that's partially a reflection of the fact that Lotto is the exclusive coverage provider of the race. But for a long time, not even Great Britain competed in the race. I think it was not until the 70s or 80s that there were American cyclists. So over time, it does kind of grow but in the years that we're talking, it is very much a French event. And when there are French cyclists or not French cyclists who are leading the race, especially in the 1919 Tour, it's with some chagrin that people kind of witness it and often, come up with their own prize purses for the top French cyclist instead,
Right.
So a lot has changed.
Well, that kind of teed up this next question that I think you already answered. But did Major Taylor enter from the United States?
Um,
He was, I think, a really early, I say African American cyclist,
yes,
if I'm not mistaken. But you said no American rider is in the 1919 tour.
correct. And it is, if I recall correctly, quite a few years, decades until there are American cyclists who compete in the race.
Okay.
Um, I think for a host of reasons. I mean, the tour doesn't occupy the same, mental headspace that it does for cycling these days as it did back then, and so you do have, you know champion cyclists in, Germany or the United States or what have you, who just aren't competing in the race. It's not the teams that they ride. That if you look at, um, La Sportive, and the companies who make up La Sportive and the companies who sponsor, um, earlier and later instances of the race, they are, it's Peugeot, it is French
Mhm.
companies who are sponsoring French cyclists. They're paying them kind of, you know, decent salaries to compete in the race, but it is not the kind of the culmination of cycling on an annual basis that exists for us now. And I think in large part, um, I think it's too much to say that it's not on people's radar, but I think it is just not a priority. There is still this lingering sense of this is a ridiculous event, like, and it is a ridiculous event.
Yeah.
And there are other ways of being a cyclist and being a champion cyclist than participating in the Tour de France. And you have track cyclists who really excel on circular tracks, and it is a certain type of person who wants to compete in the Tour and will and or can compete in the Tour.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Completely different rider. And when I was reading your book, I just remember thinking, and I love cycling, but why would anybody really want to do this?
Yeah,
So,
it
I
the
mean, I wish
the
I could, but it takes a very different kind of athlete and a very different mentality, I think, to suffer so much.
yes,
So,
and that is kind of, as much as they were professionals who really clearly wanted to do this. Most of the coverage on the kind of off days is about suffering.
mhm.
People, you know, hiring someone to give them a massage, uh, in town, others sleeping through the day, others getting drunk just so that they can kind of stave off the pain. Others, again, no such thing as performance enhancing drugs, just like drugs back then, to kind of get through it. So yeah, suffering central.
Right. Okay, let's see. Next question. Who is your favorite racer? And of course, why?
I and I hesitate to say too much just in case anyone does want to kind of pick up the book and experience the race as it, close to existed. I am very interested in Eugene Christophe. He does kind of occupy a certain model of tour cyclist back then, which is very much this, everyday person, um, who, again, a bike mechanic as a day job, rides because he likes it, is, you know, more affable than it seems like most of the other cyclists were. Um, and I'm interested in that sort of person, who chooses to kind of take on this event. And I think trying to grasp his psychology that led him to take on this suffering, especially because in earlier years he, had gotten close to winning the general classification, but never quite did. And maybe that is the key to his psychology, although that I don't think that fully captures it. Um, is really interesting to me, and I do think serves as a good model for what a tour cyclist, in the best case, kind of looked like back then. And I am also interested. I was asked to kind of try and figure out an adaptation for the book, for a film that kind of never wound up happening. But when I was working on that script and like trying to figure out how to kind of distill the different personalities and the changing fortunes of the 1919 writers, I did find myself in a, again, from a interested in psychology standpoint, really found myself drawn to Henri de Grange. I just am interested in this domineering personality, and I'm interested in the ways in which his ideology allowed him to kind of clearly succeed in, there's disputes about, whether to call him really the father of the tour, because one of his journalists came up with the actual idea, but he was the one who definitely kind of made it happen. And I'm interested in the ways that ideology kind of bred really kind of breaking contradictions in him, especially leading up to World War II. But in this kind of, in a more anti-hero than hero way, I'm very interested in him.
It's hard to imagine a tour without him.
Yes.
At that point. All right. Next question. Do bikes have gears, and who maintained the bikes?
Yeah. So bikes had 2 gears in large part back then. This is, at least tour cyclists would use 2-gear bikes. What that meant is having a different sized gear on either side of your back bike hub, which meant that if you wanted to change gears, you had to take off the back tire, turn it around, and go on your way. So what that meant is that there is kind of this calculation that you see in some of the coverage around the mountain sections primarily, where cyclists are determining, do I want to lose time switching my gear around to hopefully, ride faster, endure better up the mountain, or do I think I can kind of eke it out and not have to switch gear, only to then switch it back once the mountain is, inevitably crossed. But that is, the extent of gearing. And as far as maintenance goes, it is a very clear, it is, I think, rule number there. I think, if I remember correctly, it's rule number 1 in that back then cyclists were fully responsible for their bike frames, their wheels, their tires. They cannot have multiple frames. They can have multiple tubes. You'll often see them kind of wearing them like backpack straps. They're responsible for purchasing them alongside their food and whatnot. In the 1919 race, there is I think it's La Sportive, but maybe it's a particular company of La Sportive, like gives them consomme when they arrive, in certain towns, just to kind of warm them up, especially after kind of in the cold. They were wearing woolen jerseys. Some of them packed wax jackets. But there is a real central focus on having cyclists maintain their own bikes, and that does create incidents like in 1914 as well as in 1919, where a cyclist's fortunes in the Tour de France are made or lost. The stories we often hear are lost because their fork broke or their frame bent, riding over a rock or after a fall. And in those cases, the cyclists had to carry their frames into the next town, hope that there was some sort of, mechanic whose shop they could use, in order to fix it up and go on their way so that they could, hope that the same thing happened to the person in front of them so they could make back their time.
And speaking of the need to do some maintenance or fix the frame of your bike or tires, the next question is, were the roads surfaced or was it primarily a bike race on gravel roads?
Yeah, so it depends on the part of the country. There were surfaced roads in certain cities. Often, and in the Northwest, from what I recall, more gravel. Some of the cities will have, surfaced paved roads. The big difficult stretch tends to be in the Northeast, which is also where the Western Front was. So that is a stretch of the country that is still known for its cobbled roads, which you have shorter races like the Paris-Roubaix that is still kind of known as this horrendous race because it in large part takes place on these cobbled roads. And, as you can imagine, in the 1919 race, cyclists were going from roads that were merely not well maintained to roads that were decimated to, roads that even in their best condition are, really awful to ride across, and doing that for hundreds of miles. And, it wears on both body and bike frame.
Yes, very true. And if you want to hear more about that, I recommend you either listen to the 2022 podcast or read the book. All right, 2 more questions. You mentioned that it was not a very international field of riders. When did the Tour de France grow to include international riders in larger numbers?
Yeah, I don't have a great statistic on this. My understanding is that it is a gradual development. In large part, again, through I think like the 70s, 80s, you see a more European field with, UK, Great Britain starting to compete with larger numbers of, once the, most immediate World War I, World War II kind of dynamics die down, you have more cyclists drawn in from surrounding countries. And I think it's only, I think in that period of time that you start to get, just start to get an international crowd like United States entering the race. I don't have the particular statistics there, but I do think it kind of matches both the kind of growing presence of the Tour de France as the bike race, while other forms of bike racing really kind of die down to a great degree. You don't have people viewing track racing, for instance, to a large degree. You don't have you certainly don't have Madison Square Garden filled up for 6 days straight of people watching, cyclists ride. So the Tour's presence grows. People can listen to it on radio and television. These things are all kind of combined, and it brings a larger field and a larger corporate field to the race, and with that, the cyclists themselves.
All right, next question. Were the riders athletes in other sports or just dedicated riders? And, were there other sports for them to be involved in?
Yeah. I know that some cyclists at the time did also compete in other sports. The leading cyclists of the 1919 race were in large part cyclists. That is, what they professionally did. And there was a European circuit in, France, Italy, Belgium, that would kind of take up, that would allow them to kind of compete professionally, still with day jobs, most of them, except for a couple riders. So that cycling is the kind of event that they were really focused on. But within cycling, as I mentioned, someone like Eugene Christophe does compete in different types of cycling. I think in general, the tour cyclist is a lot more of a generalist than kind of the purpose-built cyclists or athletes generally speaking today. And I do believe, though I'm blanking on who it is, that you do see certain riders who will be like, take part in boxing or other things that are kind of closely tied with notions of physical fitness at the time. That, as I mentioned, is very closely bound up in Henri de Grange's ideology of what the tour and the tour cyclist should be. But, these were kind of much more, them being professional cyclists, we call them professional because they were paid, but it is much closer to, a really passionate hobby than something that really kind of took up their lives. And it did take up their lives in many ways. It just wasn't a profession in the sense of it being the thing that they did as their day job. It was what took up their summer, and they had corporate sponsors who kind of floated them for the summer while they were competing, and otherwise were being things like bike mechanics and whatnot.
Right. Okay, we had one more question. Could you leave us with just a sense of what it was like cycling through, I guess what we would call the Zone Rouge, the former battlefields? I think today when we watch it on TV, we see these beautiful landscapes. We see these like marvelous villages and vistas. And this was not the tour of 1919, though. So comments on what it looked like?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that is the cop-out answer, which I won't leave you with, is it is really hard to kind of fathom, I think, the devastation and kind of the total flattening of the landscape in certain regions. And, they did not ride through the largest battlefields, but they rode, very close to some of them and rode through towns like Valenciennes that did see fighting in 1918. And, I think the way I think about it is, it is a plowed up landscape, it is a dredged landscape. The road is kind of barely marked by being, a little bit flattened and a little bit cleared for their passage, but in large part, it is kind of at least in the key portions between Metz and Dunkirk, which is I think the 13th or 14th stage of 15. Total devastation in a lot of places, and towns where sections are destroyed. They did ride through a few of what were known as kind of the martyred towns that were totally destroyed or close to totally destroyed in the war and were not rebuilt. If you go to some of those places, even now, it's astounding how much of the World War I landscape is left. It's fascinating and it's incredible and it's horrifying in some sense to kind of see the landscape and the kind of scars it bears in the shell craters and whatnot, and then you will also see incredibly stunning scenes that testify to some of the rebuilding that could occur. I mean, I remember I I I didn't entirely follow the race because I wanted to spend time at certain um, portions on my journey, but I rode through a lot of the landscape in the Northeast, and rode through a lot of small towns, and you'll have very large farming communities, and then there will be kind of this small not small battlefield, but small graveyard that was set up at a copse that was destroyed in a battlefield or whatnot, and that is kind of lush and well maintained in kind of the middle. And other places, if you're near farming communities here in the U.S., you see kind of small kind of thickets that were just a little bit too stubborn to uproot. And in France, those exist too, but you'll also see the divots still of shells, but back then it would have been many of those sites would have just been totally devastated. And so it's something that's hard for me to fully get into the mindset of, because as many pictures as you see, it's hard to kind of place yourself there. But I would recommend the French National website, or French National Library does have a lot of very incredible pictures. And I think there was a series done to kind of catalog some of the devastation of buildings that I would recommend looking through. And it's kind of astounding.
Mm. Well, Aiden, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and your insights, and it's such an interesting topic. And to our audience, thank you all for joining us. We have a full slate of virtual events coming up the rest of this year. And if you want to learn more about those, please visit MacArthurMemorial.org, or there should be some event links either in the comments or episode description. So we hope you can join us again soon. And again, Aiden, thank you very, very much. And the book is Sprinting Through No Man's Land.